The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the private conference room in Addis Ababa. The African Union headquarters buzzed with an unusual tension that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. Security personnel moved with heightened alertness, their earpieces crackling with constant updates. Today was not like any other diplomatic gathering the continent had witnessed in decades. Barack Obama adjusted his tie as he walked down the corridor, flanked by his security detail. His footsteps echoed against the polished floors, each step measured and deliberate. The former President of the United States had arrived in Ethiopia under the guise of a humanitarian mission, but those in the know understood this meeting carried far more weight than any public announcement would suggest. His jaw was set with determination, yet there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that few had ever seen before. At the same time, from the opposite end of the building, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made his way toward the same destination. The young leader of Burkina Faso moved with the confidence of a man who had seized power not through birthright or political maneuvering, but through sheer force of will and the support of his people. His military uniform was impeccably pressed, his bearing proud, yet there was an alertness in his gaze that spoke of a mind constantly calculating, always ready for the unexpected. The room they were about to enter had been swept for surveillance devices 3 times. The mahogany table at its center had witnessed countless diplomatic negotiations, but none quite like what was about to unfold. 2 chairs sat across from each other, positioned with mathematical precision. The only other furniture was a small side table holding 2 glasses and a pitcher of water, and a grandfather clock whose steady ticking would soon become the only sound in a room thick with anticipation. Obama entered first, his experienced diplomatic instincts immediately assessing the space. He had requested this meeting through back channels, utilizing connections that stretched across continents and through decades of political relationships. The message that had reached Traoré was simple yet loaded with implication. The future of Africa requires us to speak privately. No agendas, no formal protocols, just 2 men who understood power in very different ways. Traoré arrived precisely 3 minutes later, a timing that was neither accidental nor coincidental. He paused at the threshold, his eyes meeting Obama's across the room. For a moment, neither man moved. The weight of history, of ideologies, of 2 fundamentally different visions for Africa's future, filled the space between them like an invisible wall. "Captain Traoré," Obama said, rising from his chair and extending his hand. His voice carried the smooth authority that had once commanded the attention of the entire world, yet there was a slight edge to it that suggested this was not merely a courtesy call. "Mr. President," Traoré replied, accepting the handshake. His grip was firm, his gaze unwavering. In that brief contact, both men seemed to take the measure of each other, like chess masters evaluating their opponent before the first move. They took their seats across from each other, the polished surface of the table reflecting their faces like a mirror. For several moments, silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Obama leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled, a gesture those who knew him would recognize as his thinking pose. Traoré sat upright, his hands flat on the table, his posture radiating the discipline of a career military officer. "You've caused quite a stir on this continent," Obama began, his tone conversational yet carrying an undercurrent of something more serious. "Young leaders overthrowing established order, speaking of sovereignty and independence. It reminds me of other times, other places." Traoré's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "Change is never comfortable for those who benefit from the status quo, Mr. President. But sometimes change is necessary for survival." "Survival," Obama repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's an interesting choice of words. Tell me, Captain, what exactly do you think Africa needs to survive? And more importantly, what do you think threatens that survival?"
The question in there like a challenge.
Traoré leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but carrying the passion that had inspired his followers. "Africa needs to control its own destiny, Mr. President. For too long, We have been told what is best for us by those who have never walked in our shoes, never felt the weight of our struggles. We have resources that could transform this continent, yet our people remain poor while others grow rich from our wealth. Obama nodded slowly, as if considering these words carefully. And you believe the solution is to reject partnerships with established allies? To turn away from institutions that have provided stability and support? I believe the solution is to build partnerships based on equality and mutual respect, not on the perpetuation of colonial relationships disguised as aid, Traoré responded, his voice gaining intensity. When France extracts uranium from Niger while Nigerian children lack electricity, when mining companies take diamonds from our soil while our communities lack clean water, we must ask ourselves who really benefits from these arrangements. The former American president was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently against the table. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. You speak of sovereignty, Captain, but sovereignty without stability is chaos. You speak of independence, but independence without allies is isolation. The world has changed since the days when nations could stand entirely alone. Has it, Mr. President?
Traoré challenge.
Or have we simply been convinced that dependence is the only path to prosperity? China built itself without Western approval. India charts its own course. Why should Africa be different? Why should we accept that our role is to provide raw materials while others add value and profit? Obama leaned back, his expression growing more serious. Because the stakes are higher than you realize, Captain. The world is not a simple place where good intentions lead to good outcomes. There are forces at play, systems that have been built over decades, relationships that maintain a delicate balance. When that balance is disrupted. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Let me share something with you that very few people know. During my presidency, I received briefings that would keep most people awake at night. Intelligence reports about resource competition, about nations positioning themselves for conflicts that might not happen for decades, about the fragility of the systems that keep the global economy functioning. Traoré listened intently, his expression unreadable. And what did these briefings tell you about Africa's place in this global system? They told me that Africa is the prize, Obama said quietly. Not just for its resources, though those are immense, but because Africa is the future. The demographics, the potential, the strategic importance, every major power in the world understands this. The question is not whether Africa will rise, but who will influence that rise. The young captain was silent for a moment, processing this admission. When he spoke, his voice was measured but firm. Then perhaps it is time for Africa to influence its own rise, rather than being influenced by others. Obama smiled slightly, but it was not a warm expression. And that, Captain, brings us to why I really requested this meeting. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, placing it on the table between them. Inside this envelope are photographs and documents that I think you should see. Information that has been gathered over the past 18 months about certain activities, certain movements of resources and personnel. Traoré looked at the envelope but did not reach for it.
What kind of information?
The kind that demonstrates just how closely certain governments have been monitoring the changes in West Africa. The kind that shows how seriously some people are taking the shift in regional dynamics. Obama's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The kind that reveals discussions about intervention scenarios, about economic pressures that could be applied, about support that could be withdrawn or redirected. The grandfather clocks ticking seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. Traoré's eyes remained fixed on Obama's face, searching for any sign of deception or manipulation. You're threatening me, Mr. President? I'm informing you, Obama replied. There's a difference. I'm telling you that the path you're on has consequences that extend far beyond Burkina Faso, far beyond West Africa. Decisions are being made in Washington, in Paris, in Beijing, in Moscow. Decisions about how to respond to what is perceived as growing instability in a strategically critical region. Traoré finally reached for the envelope, his movements deliberate and controlled. He opened it carefully and began to examine the contents. His expression remained neutral, but Obama watched as his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The documents contained surveillance photographs, transcripts of intercepted communications, financial records, and intelligence assessments. As Traoré read, Obama continued speaking. "You see, Captain, the world's powers have invested too much in the current system to allow it to be overturned by idealistic young officers, no matter how noble their intentions. There are mining contracts worth billions of dollars, strategic partnerships that maintain global stability, economic relationships that affect millions of jobs across multiple continents. When you speak of fundamental change, you're not just challenging local governments, you're challenging a global architecture." Traoré set down one of the photographs, an aerial image of a military compound in Burkina Faso taken from what was clearly a surveillance satellite. "These facilities are sovereign territory, Mr. President.
International law prohibits this kind of surveillance without consent."
"International law," Obama repeated with a slight chuckle that held no humor. "Captain, let me tell you something about international law. It exists as long as it serves the interests of those with the power to enforce it. When it doesn't serve those interests, it becomes remarkably flexible." The young military leader continued examining the documents, his composure impressive given what he was discovering. There were financial analyses showing how economic pressure could be applied to Burkina Faso, assessments of military capabilities, evaluations of potential internal opposition that could be supported or encouraged. It was a comprehensive intelligence picture that revealed just how thoroughly his country and his leadership had been studied. "Why are you showing me this?" Traoré asked finally, setting the documents back on the table. Obama leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because I believe in giving people a chance to make informed decisions. Because despite what you might think, I have no desire to see Africa plunged into chaos or conflict. And because I think you're intelligent enough to understand what you're really up against." "What I'm really up against," Traoré repeated slowly. "You mean the full weight of Western economic and military power, directed at maintaining a system that keeps Africa as a source of raw materials and cheap labor."
"I mean the reality of global power dynamics, Captain."
"I mean understanding that good intentions are not enough when you're dealing with forces that have shaped world events for centuries." Obama's voice carried a note of what might have been genuine concern. "You have options here. Paths that could allow you to achieve meaningful change without triggering responses that would ultimately harm your people." Traoré was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the documents and Obama's face. When he spoke, his voice was steady but carried an edge. "What kind of options, Mr. President? Ones that require me to abandon the principles that brought me to power? Ones that ask me to betray the trust of those who supported change? Ones that recognize the art of the possible," Obama replied. "Reform instead of revolution. Gradual change instead of sudden disruption. Working within existing systems to achieve incremental improvements rather than attempting to overthrow everything at once." The captain stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Ethiopian capital spread below. The sun was beginning to set, casting the city in golden light. For several minutes he remained silent, his back to Obama, his hands clasped behind him in a military posture. "Do you know what my grandfather told me before he died, Mr. President?" Traoré said finally, not turning around. "He told me that the colonizers never really left. They just changed their methods. Instead of direct occupation, they used debt. Instead of governors, they used compliant local leaders. Instead of colonial administrators, they used international advisors and aid programs." Obama remained seated, watching the young man's silhouette against the window. "Your grandfather lived through different times, Captain." The world was simpler then. The choices were clearer. Were they? Traoré turned back to face him. Or have we just been convinced that complexity is an excuse for accepting injustice? That pragmatism is a reason to abandon principle. Pragmatism is what keeps countries stable and people fed, Obama said firmly. Idealism without practical consideration leads to failed states and human suffering. I've seen it happen. I've had to deal with the consequences. Traoré returned to his seat, but this time he leaned forward, his intensity palpable. And I've seen what happens when people accept that there is no alternative to exploitation. I've seen children die from preventable diseases while the profits from their country's resources build mansions in foreign capitals. I've seen young people lose hope because they believe their only options are poverty or migration. The two men stared at each other across the table, the weight of fundamentally different worldviews creating an almost physical tension in the room.
Obama broke the silence first.
Let me tell you a story, Captain. In 2009, during my first year as president, I was faced with a choice regarding military intervention in Libya. The intelligence was clear. Gaddafi was planning to massacre civilians in Benghazi. The moral case for intervention seemed obvious. So we acted, with the best of intentions, believing we were preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. Obama paused, his expression growing somber. What followed was years of chaos, the rise of ISIS in North Africa, a refugee crisis that destabilized Europe, and countless deaths. Good intentions, moral clarity, decisive action. And the result was suffering on a scale that might have exceeded what we were trying to prevent. Traoré listened intently, recognizing the weight of this admission. Are you comparing my efforts to bring sovereignty to my country with foreign military intervention, Mr. President? I'm illustrating the principle that actions have consequences beyond what we can predict or control, Obama replied. When you challenge existing systems, when you disrupt established relationships, you create instability. And instability, no matter how well-intentioned, can lead to outcomes that harm the very people you're trying to help. The young captain was quiet for a moment, then responded with unexpected calm. Mr. President, with respect, your example proves the opposite point. The intervention in Libya failed not because change is dangerous, but because change imposed from outside, for foreign interests, without understanding local dynamics, is doomed to fail. What I'm advocating is change that comes from within, change that serves African interests, change that is led by Africans for Africans. Obama studied Traoré's face, seeing the conviction there, the unwavering belief. It reminded him of himself at a younger age, before the realities of power had tempered his idealism. And what happens, Captain, when that change threatens interests that are deemed too important to ignore? What happens when your vision of African independence conflicts with global economic systems that affect billions of people? Then we find out whether the international community truly believes in the principles it claims to uphold, Traoré answered. Whether sovereignty and self-determination are more than just words used to justify interventions when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. The grandfather clock chimed, marking the hour. Both men glanced at it, as if suddenly aware of how long they had been talking. Obama reached for one of the glasses of water, taking a slow sip before speaking again. Let me be very direct with you, Captain. The intelligence community has identified several scenarios for responding to what they term disruption of strategic partnerships in West Africa. These scenarios range from economic sanctions to support for internal opposition to more direct interventions. The decision about which scenario to implement will be made based on how events unfold over the next few months.
Traoré's expression hardened.
You're threatening my country and my government. I'm informing you of realities that exist whether I discuss them or not, Obama corrected. These decisions will be made by people who have never met you, who don't understand your motivations, who see only threats to interests they consider vital. I'm here because I believe there might be a way to avoid the worst outcomes. By accepting continued dependency? by abandoning the hope for true sovereignty.
Traoré's voice carried control danger.
Mr. President, you speak of avoiding the worst outcomes, but for my people, the current system is already the worst outcome. Poverty in the midst of wealth, powerlessness despite having resources, watching other nations prosper while we remain suppliers of raw materials. Obama set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. What if I told you there was a way to achieve meaningful progress without triggering the kind of response that could destroy everything you've built? What if there was a path that could bring real benefits to your people while working within existing frameworks? I would ask what the price would be, Traoré replied immediately. Because in my experience, such offers always come with a price that involves compromising the very principles that make change worthwhile. The former president was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried a different tone, more personal, less diplomatic. The price would be patience, Captain. The price would be accepting that change happens gradually, through negotiation and compromise, through building alliances and finding common ground. Patience, Traoré repeated. How long should my people be patient, Mr. President? How many more generations should accept poverty while waiting for gradual change? How many more children should die from preventable diseases while we negotiate with those who profit from their suffering? Obama leaned forward, his expression intense. How many children will die if your country becomes a battleground? How much suffering will result if economic collapse follows international isolation? You speak of principles, Captain, but leadership requires considering not just what is right, but what is possible, what is sustainable, what will actually improve people's lives rather than just making us feel better about our moral positions. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock. Both men seemed lost in their own thoughts, each weighing the other's words against their own convictions. The sun had set completely now, and the room was lit only by the overhead lights, creating stark shadows on their faces. Traoré stood again, but this time he moved to the side table and poured water into both glasses, offering one to Obama. It was a small gesture, but somehow it seemed to shift the dynamic in the room, creating a moment of human connection amid the political tension. Mr. President, Traoré said as he returned to his seat, let me tell you what I see when I look at the current system. I see a continent with 35% of the world's mineral reserves, but whose people rank among the poorest globally. I see nations that export cocoa but cannot afford chocolate, that mine gold but cannot build schools, that pump oil but lack electricity. I see a system that has been designed to extract wealth from Africa for the benefit of others. Obama accepted the glass with a nod of acknowledgement. And I see a system that, however imperfect, has maintained relative stability and prevented the kind of catastrophic conflicts that plagued this continent in previous decades. I see partnerships that, while unequal, have provided some benefits, some development, some progress. Some benefits for some people, Traoré countered. Mostly for those who were already privileged, mostly in ways that maintain the fundamental structures of exploitation. Mr. President, the stability you speak of is the stability of injustice. It is the peace of the graveyard for the aspirations of millions of young Africans. Obama was quiet for a moment, then spoke with what seemed like genuine curiosity. What makes you so certain that your path will lead to better outcomes? What makes you believe that disrupting existing systems will result in improvements rather than chaos? Traoré met his gaze directly. Because I've seen what happens when people have hope, when they believe change is possible, when they have leaders who put their interests first. I've seen communities transform when they control their own resources, when they make their own decisions, when they're not waiting for permission from distant capitals to improve their own lives. And I've seen what happens when hope collides with reality, Obama replied. When good intentions meet the immovable forces of global economics and power politics. I've seen promising movements crushed not because they were wrong, but because they underestimated the strength of the systems they were challenging. The conversation was reaching a crucial point, both men sensing that they were approaching the heart of their fundamental disagreement. Obama reached again for the manila envelope, withdrawing another document. "Captain, this is a classified assessment of your country's strategic vulnerabilities. Economic pressure points, supply chain dependencies, financial relationships that could be severed or manipulated. It's not just about military intervention. Modern warfare is economic, diplomatic, informational." Traoré examined the document, his expression growing increasingly serious as he read. It was a comprehensive analysis of how Burkina Faso could be isolated, pressured, and ultimately forced to change course without a single shot being fired. "This is what you're up against," Obama continued. "Not just opposition from local elites or regional powers, but a systematic campaign to demonstrate that your approach cannot succeed. To make an example that will discourage similar movements elsewhere on the continent." The young captain set down the document and looked directly at Obama. "Then they will make a martyr instead of achieving compliance. Mr. President, you seem to believe that the threat of consequences will change my mind, but you misunderstand something fundamental about why I chose this path." "Enlighten me," Obama said quietly. Traoré leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "I chose this path not because I believed it would be easy or safe, but because I believed it was necessary. I chose it not because I was guaranteed success, but because I could not live with accepting injustice as permanent. I chose it because I would rather fail fighting for sovereignty than succeed by accepting dependence." Obama studied the young man's face, seeing something there that reminded him of his own youth, his own idealism before it had been tempered by experience and responsibility. "That's a luxury, Captain. A luxury that your people may pay for with their lives and futures." "No, Mr. President," Traoré replied firmly. "It's a necessity that my people have already paid for with their lives and futures. The current system is not working for them. The gradual change you advocate has been promised for decades without delivering meaningful results. At some point, you have to choose between the risk of trying something different and the certainty of continued suffering under the status quo." The two men sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of history seemed to press down on the room, the echoes of countless similar conversations between representatives of established power and those seeking to challenge it. Finally, Obama spoke, his voice carrying a note of what might have been admiration mixed with concern.
"You know, Captain, you remind me of someone who knows it to know."
Someone who believed that the arc of history bends toward justice, that moral clarity could overcome political reality, that the force of truth could move mountains. "What happened to that person?" Traoré asked. "He became President of the United States and learned that mountains don't move easily, that truth without power is often just noise, that the arc of history is longer than any individual lifetime." Obama paused, then added quietly, "He learned that sometimes the choice is not between good and evil, but between imperfect progress and catastrophic idealism." Traoré considered this for a moment, then responded with quiet intensity. Perhaps he also learned that sometimes the choice is between comfortable complicity and necessary courage. That sometimes progress requires someone to pay the price that others are unwilling to pay. Obama reached into his jacket again, this time withdrawing a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the table between them. "This is a proposal, Captain. A framework for what could be called managed transition. Economic partnerships that provide more equitable terms, development aid that comes with fewer strings, political support for reforms that don't threaten core strategic interests. It's not everything you want, but it's more than what exists now." Traoré looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. "What would it require from me?"
"Moderation."
"Patience. A willingness to work within existing institutions rather than trying to replace them. Public statements that reassure international partners about continuity and stability." Obama's voice was careful, measured. "In return, you would have support for development programs, access to international markets on better terms, and protection from the kind of destabilization efforts that have targeted other reform movements. The young captain finally picked up the paper, reading through it carefully. It was a comprehensive framework that would indeed provide some benefits to Burkina Faso while keeping the country firmly within existing international structures. As he read, Obama watched his face for any sign of consideration or acceptance. "This is generous, Mr. President," Traoré said finally. "More generous than I expected. But it's also fundamentally flawed." "How so?" "Because it assumes that gradual reform within existing systems can address structural injustices. Because it asks me to abandon the principle of sovereignty in exchange for better treatment within a system of dependency. Because it offers improvements to the symptoms while preserving the disease." Obama leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "Captain, this is your chance to achieve real benefits for your people without the risks that come with confronting the entire global system. This is pragmatic idealism, using the possible to move toward the ideal." Traoré set the paper down and stood, walking again to the window. Outside, the lights of Addis Ababa twinkled in the darkness, each light representing lives, dreams, aspirations. When he turned back to Obama, his expression was resolute.
"Mr. President, let me ask you something."
If you had accepted a similar offer during the civil rights movement, if you had been told that gradual change within existing systems was the only realistic path, that confronting structural racism directly was too dangerous, too disruptive, where would America be today? Obama was quiet for a long moment. "That's different, Captain. That was a domestic movement within established democratic institutions." "Was it?"
Traoré challenged.
"Or was it a movement that challenged fundamental power structures, that disrupted comfortable arrangements, that faced massive resistance from those who benefited from the status quo? The only difference is that it succeeded, so now we call it necessary and inevitable. But at the time, it was dismissed as radical and dangerous." The former president rubbed his temples, a gesture of fatigue or frustration. "The comparison isn't perfect, Captain. The international system is more complex, more fragile, more interconnected. The consequences of disruption are greater." "The consequences of accepting injustice are also greater," Traoré replied. "Mr. President, you speak of complexity, but sometimes complexity is used as an excuse for inaction. Yes, the international system is interconnected, but it's interconnected in ways that benefit some at the expense of others. Yes, disruption has consequences, but so does maintaining systems that perpetuate exploitation." Obama stood and joined Traoré at the window, both men looking out at the city below. For a moment, they stood in silence, two leaders separated by generation, experience, and worldview, but united in their concern for the future.
"You know what frightens me most about your path, Captain,"
Obama said quietly. "It's not that you might fail. Failure is always a possibility in any endeavor. It's that you might succeed in ways that trigger responses that destroy not just your progress, but the progress of the entire continent." Traoré turned to look at him. "And what frightens me most about your path, Mr. President, is that it guarantees continued suffering in the name of avoiding risk. That it asks people to accept injustice in order to prevent greater injustice. That it makes complicity seem like wisdom." They returned to their seats, both men seeming to sense that their conversation was approaching its conclusion. Obama gathered the documents back into the manila envelope, his movements deliberate and careful. "I have one more thing to show you, Captain," he said, withdrawing a final document. "This is a timeline. It shows when certain decisions will be made if no agreement is reached, when certain pressures will be applied, when certain options will be activated. You have perhaps 6 months before the situation becomes irreversible." Traoré examined the timeline, seeing dates marked for economic measures, diplomatic initiatives, and what were euphemistically called stability operations. It was a roadmap for the systematic dismantling of his government and his vision for his country. 6 months, he repeated.
And if he accepts your proposal?
Then this timeline becomes irrelevant. Then you become a partner rather than a target. Then your people benefit from cooperation rather than suffering from confrontation. Obama's voice carried both promise and warning. But the offer won't remain on the table indefinitely. There are forces at work that I cannot control forever. Traoré folded the timeline and placed it in his pocket. Mr. President, I appreciate your directness. I appreciate that you've shown me the reality of what I'm facing. But I think you misunderstand something fundamental about leadership.
What is that?
Leadership is not about choosing the safe path or the easy path or even the path most likely to succeed. Leadership is about choosing the right path and then doing everything possible to make it work.
Traoré's voice carried quiet conviction.
You ask me to abandon my principles for practical benefits, but principles abandoned for practical reasons were never really principles at all. Obama leaned back in his chair, studying the young man across from him. And if your principles lead to the destruction of everything you've built? If your refusal to compromise results in worse outcomes for your people than what exists now, then at least they will know that someone tried to offer them something better. At least they will know that their leader believed they deserved sovereignty and dignity and the chance to control their own destiny. Traoré met Obama's gaze directly. Mr. President, you offer me a comfortable cage in exchange for abandoning the dream of freedom. But a comfortable cage is still a cage. The room fell silent again, the weight of their fundamental disagreement settling between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Both men seemed to understand that no amount of discussion would change the other's mind, that they represented worldviews that were simply incompatible. Obama stood, extending his hand across the table. Captain Traoré, I respect your convictions, even if I believe they will lead to tragedy. I hope, for the sake of your people, that I am wrong and you are right. Traoré accepted the handshake, his grip firm and steady. And I hope, Mr. President, that you will remember this conversation in the months to come. When you see what happens to those who choose principle over pragmatism, I hope you will ask yourself whether the stability you helped preserve was worth the price that others paid for it. They released their handshake, but neither man moved toward the door. Both seemed to understand that this moment represented something significant, a point where paths diverged in ways that would shape not just their own futures, but the future of an entire continent. There is one thing I want you to understand, Captain, Obama said finally. Nothing that happens from this point forward is personal. The decisions that will be made, the actions that will be taken, they're not about you as an individual. They're about systems, about structures, about the maintenance of order that billions of people depend on. Traoré nodded slowly.
I understand, Mr. President.
And I want you to understand that what I do from this point forward is not about personal ambition or ego. It's about the belief that my people deserve better than the order that has failed them for generations. Obama moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. Captain, if you change your mind, if you decide that compromise is preferable to confrontation, the offer I've made will remain available. But not indefinitely. I appreciate that, Mr. President. But I should tell you now that I will not change my mind. I cannot change my mind and still face myself in the mirror, still face my people, still face the legacy I want to leave. Obama nodded, a gesture that might have been respect or might have been regret. Then I suppose we both know what comes next. Yes, Traoré replied quietly. We both know what comes next. Obama opened the door and stepped into the corridor, followed by his security detail. Traoré remained in the room for several more minutes, standing at the window, looking out at a continent that was about to be tested in ways that would determine its future for generations to come. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, marking time that was running out for decisions that had already been made, for paths that had already been chosen, for a confrontation that now seemed as inevitable as the sunrise. In rooms across multiple continents, phones would soon ring, messages would be sent, plans would be activated. But in that conference room in Addis Ababa, Ibrahim Traoré stood alone, silent, his mind processing not just what had been said, but what had been left unsaid. The weight of Obama's words, the implications of the documents he had seen, the timeline that now ticked in his pocket like a bomb. For the first time since assuming power, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was truly, completely speechless. Not from shock or fear, but from the profound understanding of what lay ahead. Not from uncertainty about his path, but from the crystal-clear certainty of the price he would have to pay for walking it. The silence that followed Obama's departure was not empty. It was full of determination, full of resolve, full of the quiet strength that comes from choosing the difficult path because it is the right path. It was the silence of a man who had looked into the abyss and decided to walk forward anyway. It was the silence that would shake nations.